All right, we're in Mark chapter 2 this morning. Mark chapter 2, down at the end of the chapter, verse 23 is where we're going to start. I wanted to mention about the scripture reading this morning. I don't know who's doing it next Sunday, but they can thank me for skipping that genealogy in Luke's account of the gospel. So it's not going to be read in our scripture reading, all those names, but that doesn't mean it's not important. So just because we're skipping over it, don't think it's not important. It has its place, and it shows us Jesus' lineage all the way back to Adam, which is fascinating in and of itself, showing us the harmony of the Bible and, so many things we learn from that. But I was thinking about it, and, we talked about Wednesday night in our Bible class on Hebrews, how, that the Old Testament and Judaism was all based on those genealogies, and without it, you couldn't prove that you were a descendant of Abraham and those things. And along comes somebody like Melchizedek, who has no genealogy, yet he is superior even to Abraham. God was trying to teach a lesson with that. But those genealogies are important, and I just figured it wouldn't be, nice to make somebody read all those names. But anyway, we're in Mark, and our last lesson we talked about a couple of things. Jesus, of course, has begun his public ministry. He's gone around the Sea of Galilee, back to Capernaum. He started there and came back around to there. And he's performing miracles. He's teaching in the synagogue. He's preaching by the seashore, calling disciples. So far, Peter and Andrew, James and John, and then Matthew, who's also called Levi. And Jerry asked me last Sunday, he's called the son of Alphaeus in verse 14 of this chapter. Was he the brother of James, the son of Alphaeus? And the answer I have to that is maybe. He could have been. The Bible doesn't tell us for sure, but same father had the same name, so it's possible that they were brothers. There's a lot of kinship in the disciples of Jesus and John and those things as well. But anyway, he calls Matthew, and then he has that meal with him, and the Pharisees are upset because he's eating with publicans and sinners, and Jesus makes the point to them that that's who needs the gospel. And he's trying to point out to them that they need it also. They just don't see that because they think that they are righteous. And so then they question him about fasting, why his disciples don't fast, and he said because the bridegroom is here. You don't fast when, the groom is there. That's when it's time to celebrate. And so while Jesus was on the earth, it wasn't the time for fasting. And then he talked about the an old garment, and you don't sew new material to it, and new wine and old wineskins. And he was showing us that his doctrine, the gospel, is not compatible with any other doctrine, including the Old Testament. Not that it contradicts it or anything like that. It's the fulfillment of it. But it's not a part of the Old Testament. It's an entirely new system. It is the new covenant, the New Testament. And we should be thankful for that because that old one, was perfect for what God intended it. But it wasn't intended to be our means of salvation. And the gospel actually provides a remedy for our sins. But in all of these things, the common theme is, in Mark's account, he's showing Jesus in his role as priest and the priestly work that he's doing, but he's also demonstrating how Jesus is challenging the doctrines and traditions of the Pharisees. And so when we pick up in verse 23, we find that still happening, and Mark's going to draw attention to it all the way into chapter 3. But verse 23 says, "It came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day. And his disciples began, as they went, to pluck the ears of corn." And before we go any further, let me just make it clear that when we read, pluck the ears of corn, we think of corn and, pulling an ear off and shucking it and those things. The word here is actually the word for wheat or for grain. So they weren't picking ears of corn, but they were pulling off the grain and then rubbing it in their hands and then blowing away the chaff and eating what was left behind. So they weren't picking corn, they were actually picking grain. But anyway, that's how it's translated here in the King James Version. Verse 24, the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priests, and gave also to them which were with him. And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. And so Jesus has challenged them on some of their beliefs and their ideas and their doctrines about healing sickness, miraculously, of course, but also about forgiving sins, about who you can eat with, about, his doctrine and how it's different, and all of these things that we've seen. And now he is challenging them on their understanding of the Sabbath. And this was, important. This was a big deal because the Jews had placed so much emphasis on the Sabbath, and not that it was wrong to do that. God placed emphasis on the Sabbath, but they had done so in a way that was so misconstrued that they'd missed the entire point of why God instituted the Sabbath in the first place. And so Jesus is trying to correct that misunderstanding so they could, see that he didn't do anything wrong here, but also to draw them, back to you have to do what God says, not what your tradition teaches. So a couple of things in the background here that we should keep in mind. Jesus, after what we've been reading about, where he talked about the wineskins and those things, he actually traveled to Jerusalem and he healed a man at the pool of Bethesda on the Sabbath day. And that's recorded for us in John 5, 1 through 16. And so it takes place in between these events here. And after he healed this man on the Sabbath day, he taught the Jews there at the end of John chapter 5 that he was the Son of God. And he provided witnesses, evidence, and testimony that confirmed his deity. And so he was showing them that he was the Son of God and therefore equal with God. And then he comes back to Capernaum, and again on the Sabbath day, he's in the field plucking these grains and eating them. And so he's healing on the Sabbath day. Now he's eating on the Sabbath day and doing these other things he'll continue to do into chapter 3. And it's a continual challenge to the Jews, both in Judea, around Jerusalem, and here in Galilee, in the north. So this was an important part of Jesus' teaching for them to have a proper understanding of the Sabbath day. So if it was important for them, it's important for us. And I think we need to understand the Sabbath also. So we're going to do a little bit of that this morning and go back to the Old Testament, to the giving of the Ten Commandments, first of all, in Exodus 20, and talk about this commandment concerning the Sabbath and look at what God teaches us about it. There are three things I think we need to understand about the Sabbath day and its purpose as God instituted it. So first of all, in Exodus 20, of course, you have the giving of the Ten Commandments, and the first four have to do with man and his relationship to God, and the last six with his relationship to man. And that fourth commandment about the Sabbath day is kind of the transition. It kind of deals with both God and man. But this is what God says about the Sabbath day. And keep in mind that after this, it's like, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. Very simple statements. But for the Sabbath day, God said this in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So he tells us why God set apart the Sabbath day, and he specifies some of the things they're supposed to remember in relation to it. So there are three things I want to point out to us from this passage and a couple of others in the Old Testament. First of all, the Sabbath day was to be a day of rest. So we see that, obviously, 6 days you can work, you can labor, but on the Sabbath day, he says, you shall not do any work. And so the purpose of the Sabbath day was to be a day of not working. And that may seem kind of strange to us that that would be so important to God, but it was very important. And there were spiritual reasons for that God's people needed to understand, and I think we still need to understand today. Obviously, it's good to have a day off, and we understand the need for that physically and mentally and psychologically and those things, but it was more than that God was giving his people. God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested, which means he ceased from his labor. He didn't do any work. And God didn't do that because he was tired or because he needed a vacation or he needed a day off, because he's God. But he did it to establish a pattern for men to follow. And there are physical benefits from it, but it's more than just the physical. But it's supposed to be a day of rest. If you look over to chapter 31 of Exodus, and starting at, let's say, verse number 12, here's what the Lord said. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. Ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it, shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And so God says, again, emphasizing the Sabbath day is to be a day of rest. He says because it's a sign between him and his people. The fact that they would work 6 days and then not work on the seventh day was a sign of this relationship and this covenant between God and Israel. And so God put it into place as a sign. And so, the Gentile nations didn't have this law, and, they worked 7 days or whatever, and we'll see that in just a moment over in Nehemiah. But God's people had a day of rest. And that doesn't make sense from a worldly perspective, where you're trying to make money and you're trying to advance yourself in your career or whatever. You work whenever you can. And if you have to work 7 days a week, however many hours a week you have to work, you're always working because that's what's important to you. And what God was trying to show his people is that he instructed them to do their work for 6 days and then have an entire day where they did no work. And the reason for that was spiritual as much as it was physical. It was a sign that they were his people. So just like circumcision was a sign, this was another sign of that. So it was to be a day of rest. Secondly, along with that, it was to be a day of remembrance. So they were not to do any work. What were they supposed to do? Just sit around and do nothing all day and be lazy? That wasn't what God intended, but he intended for it to be an opportunity for them to remember. And that means to reflect upon and to focus on two things. Number one, to remember their Creator. Every time the Sabbath day came around, they were supposed to be reminded that God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh. And that's why I've worked 6 days this week and I'm resting this day. I'm following the pattern of God. And so you could never get away from God. You go about your life through the week, going to your job, trying to earn a living, all of those things. That's all well and good. But at the end, you have to stop and remember, God made me. And all this work that I'm doing and all this effort that I'm putting toward this money is what it is. But God is real, and God created me. And one day I'm going to answer to Him for how I've lived my life. And so it was a day to stop and remember that there's a God who created us and a God to whom we will give account. And then along with that, it was a day to remember spiritual things. A couple of passages about that over in Leviticus chapter 16, and let's see, verse 31. Let me find it real quick. We'll just read this one verse. It says, "It shall be a Sabbath of rest unto you, and ye shall afflict your souls by a statute forever." Now, this Sabbath is specifically about the Day of Atonement, which was also a Sabbath day. But on that day, a day of rest, you're not supposed to do any work. But on that day, you were also supposed to afflict your soul, meaning that you were to think about what the high priest was doing when he was going into the most holy place and offering that sacrifice for your sins. You were to remind yourself that you were a sinner in need of salvation. So the Sabbath day wasn't just a day to sit around and do nothing, but it was a day to focus on and to reflect on and to remember spiritual things. Again, during the week, you're working and you're thinking about money and how can I make more and all of those things. And then you have to stop and remember there's more to life. There's more to me than just material things, than money and my job and those things. There's a God and there's a spirit in man. And I'm more than money, more than material things. Over in the Minor Prophets in Amos chapter 8 and verse number 4. Listen to these words. I think it's powerful what he says here. He says, "Hear this, O ye that swallow up the needy, even to make the poor of the land to fail, saying, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances by deceit, that we may buy the poor for silver, and the needy for a pair of shoes, yea, and sell the refuse of the wheat. The Lord hath sworn by the excellency of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their works." And so this is what they turned the Sabbath into. It's supposed to be a day of stopping your work, taking your focus off of material things and thinking about God and spiritual things and having that focus. And they turned it into, how long is it going to be until we can start selling again? So did they keep the Sabbath? Technically, yes. They didn't work on the Sabbath. But did they really keep the Sabbath? They didn't. Their heart wasn't in it. It's like us, when we assemble to worship. It's easy to show up to be at the building and to be a part of the assembly. It's another thing to actually worship, right? You can go through the motions or you can actually have your heart in it. Well, they were going through the motions of keeping the Sabbath. They didn't dare work on the Sabbath day. They didn't even want Jesus to heal somebody on the Sabbath day. That would be practicing medicine. They didn't want him walking through the field to pluck the grains because that's harvesting a crop. And when he, rubbed his hands together with it in there, well, that's threshing wheat. You're working on the Sabbath day. But in their minds, they couldn't wait for the sun to set so they could start selling again. All they were thinking about was material things. On the day, they were supposed to be focused on spiritual things. So it was supposed to be a day of remembrance and remembering spiritual things and especially remembering God. And then the third thing, the Sabbath day, it was to be a day of rest, a day of remembrance, and a day of reliance. And this was the overall point and purpose of the Sabbath day, to remind the children of Israel that they were dependent upon God. It was a statement of faith to say that I could go to work today and I could make this much money today, but I'm going to put God first and I'm going to trust in Him to take care of me even if I don't work today. That was a statement being made by keeping the Sabbath. You remember in Exodus 16 when they were gathering manna, that they were told, not to gather on the Sabbath day, to gather twice as much on the sixth day, and then not to on the seventh day. And what happened that first seventh day? Well, they all went out to gather. There wasn't anything there. And Moses says, what's wrong with you? I told you, God said, get enough. So they tried on other days to get too much to save it over, and it grew worms and rotted. And then when it came time for the Sabbath day, they didn't and thought they'd just go out and get it, and there was nothing there. And Moses gets frustrated with them. But the point was that God would give you enough in the week and enough on the sixth day that you would have sufficient for the Sabbath day. So you didn't go out and work because you put your trust in God to provide. And that was a reminder that all the things that you got during the week that you worked for, God actually provided those also. You worked for it, yes, but God's the one who blessed you with it. And the Sabbath was to be a reminder of that. In Deuteronomy 5, in this second account of the giving of the Ten Commandments, there's a statement that's added here that kind of makes this point. It's in verse 15. He says, and remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. Why? Because you were servants in Egypt. You were slaves, and God delivered you. So every time you kept the Sabbath day, you were reminding yourself that God is the one who takes care of me. God is the one who delivered me from Egypt, and God's the one who provides for me. That's why when you come over to Leviticus chapter 25, you find out that it's not just Sabbath days, but there were Sabbath years. You would plant your crops and harvest your crops for 6 years, and then on the seventh year, you didn't plant anything. You just let everything go and let it go wild for a year. And you didn't even go out and harvest it. You didn't go gather grapes, and you didn't, whatever came up on it, you didn't go get it. God gave you enough in the sixth year to get you through the seventh year. And if you trusted God, then that's what you did. And if you didn't trust him, then you would, go out and plant your crops and whatever. So how many, of the Jews do you think trusted God enough not to plant their crops that seventh year? Well, it wasn't just that. There wasn't just Sabbath days and Sabbath years. After 7 Sabbath years, 49 years, you had the 50th year, which was Jubilee. And in the year of Jubilee, because the 49th year was a Sabbath year, now you have another year that's 2 years in a row that were Sabbath years where you didn't plant and you didn't reap your harvest. And also, slaves were freed and you returned back to, if you had to sell your property or whatever, everybody went back to their original inheritance. And all that's involved in the Jubilee. But it's a testament of faith that I trust God enough that he's going to give me enough in the 48th year that it's going to see me through the 49th and the 50th. Now, how many times do you think they did that? We'll put it to you this way. Jeremiah tells us that when God sent them into the land of Babylon, into captivity, that they would be there for 70 years so the land of Canaan could have its jubilees. That's how many jubilees they had not kept. And when you take the amount of time they had been in the land of Canaan and you divide it up into those 50-year segments, they didn't keep it once. They never kept a jubilee year, and so they went into captivity, and the land lay fallow for 70 years. So God was serious about this, but he wanted them to do this as an act of faith, that they were relying upon God. Now, one more passage in the Old Testament, 2 more real quick, and then we'll go back to Mark. But go with me to the book of Nehemiah, and this is after captivity. So they've been in Assyria and then in Babylon, and they're finally coming back to the land of Canaan. The remnant is. You come to Nehemiah, let's say 10 and verse 31, first of all. And it says, and if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day, and that we would leave the 7th year and the exaction of every debt. And so Nehemiah is talking about Verse 28, you see it's the people and the priests and the Levites. They're talking about what they have to do since they've come back. God punished us for not keeping his law, and he sent us away for 70 years. And now that we've come back, we've got to take this seriously. And so one of the things that we have to do is when the Gentiles come on the Sabbath day, knocking on our door trying to sell us something, we can't buy anything because we'll be violating the Sabbath. So he's trying to make the point that they had to take this seriously. And then you come to chapter 13 and verse number 15, and you have kind of the explanation of this. He says, "In those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, and also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals." So they're doing all this work and bringing all this in on the Sabbath day. And so what did Nehemiah do? He preached to them. He testified to them. You're not supposed to do this. This is against the law of God. Verse 16, "There dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which had brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers thus? And did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath." And so he calls them out for what they're doing. And he stands up to the leaders in Judah and says, "You can't do this. This is why we went into the captivity in the first place. And if you do this, God's going to punish us again." Well, they didn't want to hear that because it's money making, right? And so they were focused on the material things and making money, even if you have to do it on the Sabbath day. So verse 19 says, "It came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. So the merchants and sellers of all kind of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice." So the leaders of Judah wouldn't listen to him. So what did Nehemiah do? He just ordered the gates to be closed, and he had his servants loyal to him to set a guard and not let anybody open the gate. So the Gentiles come bringing their stuff to sell, and the gates are closed on the Sabbath because of Nehemiah. And so they set up camp outside of the city. And he said they did it once or twice. And then verse 21, he says, "Then I testified against them and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath." And so Nehemiah threatened them. If you don't leave, there's going to be trouble. And apparently, they believed him and took him at his word. And so they stopped coming on the Sabbath day. Now, there's a lesson there, obviously, a principle that applies in so many areas, that if we're going to, keep the law of God, we need to be serious about it. And when we're not doing it, somebody needs to call us out on it. And that's exactly what Nehemiah did. He probably wasn't a popular man for doing that, for telling people, that you can't sell these things on the Sabbath day. But he was right. And he was right because that's what the word of the Lord said. And it wasn't that God was against people making money and any of those things. The point was, you have 6 days to do that. This is a day to be devoted to the Lord and thinking about him and reflecting upon him and trusting in him, demonstrating your trust in him. And that's how the Sabbath day was a sign that Israel, they were the people of God, because they lived by that trust in him. And they showed it in their lives by not working on the Sabbath or the Sabbath year or the Jubilee years. So it was a statement of trust. Did it make sense? Was there a human reason not to do those things? Of course not. But it was right because God said so. And if you trusted in God, you would do what he said. So let's take that now back to Mark and this story of Jesus and notice a lesson that we learn. Jesus was with his disciples walking through this field, and the Pharisees, of course, confronted him and asked, why are they doing that on the Sabbath, which is not lawful? And it makes you wonder, why were those Pharisees there on the Sabbath day? It's almost like they were just following Jesus around to try to find something, to get something on him. And they thought that they had. So Jesus says to them, haven't you ever read about David? When David went into the tabernacle, when he was hungry, he and the people who were with him, and they ate the showbread. That was against the law of Moses. David had no right to go in there in the first place, and certainly no right to eat the showbread. That was only for the Levites, for the priest. David was from the tribe of Judah. So what he did violated the law of Moses. It was wrong for him to do that. And Jesus says, what he's saying to them is, you know that story, right? You study your Bibles, you know the Old Testament scriptures, but none of them condemned David for doing that because it was David. David was their greatest king. And so they didn't condemn him for doing something that actually broke the law of Moses. But now Jesus is doing something that doesn't break the law of Moses. The law of Moses didn't command that you had to fast on the Sabbath day. You could eat, you just couldn't build a fire and cook a meal. So you could prepare your food before, or even what he did. He's not harvesting crops on the Sabbath day. He's not working, but he's just eating. He didn't violate the law of Moses, but he did violate their traditions. They said that you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. The law of Moses didn't say that, but they did. And so Jesus is saying, you are condemning me for violating your tradition, but you don't condemn David for actually violating the law of Moses. And the point that he's making ultimately is that what they showed to David because of their respect for him and their devotion to him because of his role as king should be shown even more so to Jesus, because he is the true king. And he's greater than David. He is the Son of God. And so when he says at the end there, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath, what he means is, I'm the one who instituted this law in the first place. I know what it means. I gave the law about the Sabbath day. I know what I was saying. And what I was saying was not that you couldn't go through the field and eat some grains. I'm the one who gave the law. I am God. And so I know what it says, and I'm not violating it, and he wasn't going to, and he didn't. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. God made this law to benefit man, and they had turned it into, something completely opposite, that you had to keep their traditions and their opinions about it, or they would condemn you. So Jesus, in doing this, is stating his deity, stating that his knowledge of the Scripture is greater than theirs, and stating that he is superior to David, which obviously, if he's the Son of God, then he is. And so he knows what the law about the Sabbath day is, and their tradition was not what the law said. So he's calling them out, and he's doing it, very straightforward and plainly to them. And this is, one of those things that's it's kind of building to their hatred of Jesus and to their turning against him. But it's a fascinating thing to understand, how they twisted this day that God made to be a day of rest where you could focus on spiritual things and think about him. And they turned it into all these traditions and opinions and, made it something that was a burden to people rather than what God intended it to be. And again, Jesus is pointing them back to the truth of the Old Testament scriptures and then to himself as the fulfillment of it. And so his law superseding it. So the other gospel accounts mention this same thing and teach a couple of the lessons. We won't have time to do that, but I want to look at those just briefly next time. And there's kind of three different things that are mentioned in the three accounts, and they all kind of tie together nicely. So we'll look at that at the beginning next time and then go into chapter 3, where again we're on the Sabbath day, and Jesus heals a man, and once again it causes a controversy. But we'll have to stop here because we're out of time. But we'll pick up there and go into chapter 3, Lord willing, next time.